3, we're moving north of the border. Canada makes the Aurthur Burns mistake. Tell us more about that, Gary.
All right. So everyone, spoiler warning, we're going to talk about economic history. I know you're really excited. Please don't turn off this channel yet. But here's your economic history. I know everyone's so excited. Like they tune in because who doesn't want to know more economic history? So if we go back, the horrible inflation that the United States had in the late 1970s, where we had gas lines and just all kinds of horrible problems, that actually started in the 1960s. And the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time was Aurthur Burns. And we had bad inflation, and Burns followed the usual prescription, which is to raise interest rates. And it started to be effective. And the inflation rate, the CPI, started to come down. And now I don't know if this part of the story is true, but the legend goes that President Lyndon Johnson at the time was at his ranch in Texas, called Burns to come see him. President Johnson was a large man. He was an imposing physical figure. And the story goes that he picked up Burns, slammed him against a wall, and told him, "You will lower interest rates," and it basically intimidated the Fed chairman into lowering rates. Now, the problem with that is Burns let off too soon, lowered interest rates, and inflation came roaring back. And what ended up happening was Burns was replaced later in the 1970s by Paul Volcker as chairman of the Fed. And what Volcker had to do to get inflation under control was he ran the Fed funds rate up around to somewhere around the 20% mark. Okay, so people right now are complaining that the midpoint of the Fed funds range today is 5.3%. Try to imagine it being 4 times that level. Try to imagine getting, right now, people are upset about 7 or 8% mortgage rates. Try to imagine 25% mortgage rates. Right. And this is what people were living with in the late 70s and early 80s. It was a huge problem. And a lot of it was caused by the fact that Aurthur Burns let up early. Now, what happened in Canada was they're having the same issues that governments all over the world are. Central banks are being begged by their financial communities, just like here in the United States. They're saying, please lower rates, lower rates, lower rates, because it blows up asset bubbles. And if you own a lot of stocks, it's a great way to make a lot of money. And they don't care that they're going to ruin the economy with that. They just want to make a lot of money today. And I'm not against people making money, but there are more sane ways to do it. So the Bank of Canada, they blinked, and they blinked really early, and they reduced their policy rate, their version of the Fed funds rate, to 4.75%. I think they lowered 25 basis points. So I think they were at 5%. They went down to 4.75%.
That's correct.
Yeah. And so here's what happened. The May inflation data the April inflation data in Canada had been 2.7%. People were expecting 2.6%. They got 2.9. Right. And so right as soon as they tried to lower rates just by the smallest amount that they could, inflation comes roaring back. And basically what that tells me is that no one in Canada knows anything about economic history. If you are in the Canadian government and you are watching this, congratulations, you have now learned some economic history. Reach out at Deep Knowledge Investing. We can help you here because you guys need it. I don't know what to tell you. And I grew up just outside of Detroit. I grew up in Michigan. Literally, we would go to Windsor for dinner or for drinks. Toronto was a day trip. Canada was a wonderful neighbor. I wish nothing but health and happiness for our Canadian friends, but this was not a good decision.
Definitely, you would think, Gary, this has got to be getting Powell's attention. Clearly, Canada missed, and as you pointed out, hasn't been reading the weekly 5 things.
Yeah.
How do they miss this badly? And then how much attention does Powell look at this in terms of keeping that higher for longer mantra?
So, Rob, part of the issue is most people in government are financially illiterate. It's not what gets them elected. In general, the people who know a lot about finance they don't end up in politics. In fact, it's sort of a detriment, right? One of the ways you get elected is by promising people things that are infeasible, impossible, right? You promise, yeah, we're going to buy you this, we're going to get you that, we're going to increase spending on this program. You like this, we'll get you that, free this. Right. And that you get elected by promising things that you couldn't possibly pay for. Anybody who has a financially minded brain is unlikely to be elected. So, my guess is there are very few people in Canada who know US financial history from 40 and 50 years ago, but they should if they're running the Bank of Canada. Or, maybe they were just pressured and they went along with it. Here in the US, I guarantee you, Powell knows this story. He knows it inside and out. And one of the reasons why, for the last 2 years, as people have been screaming for lower rates at DKI, we've said, absolutely not. It's not going to happen. Powell means it when he says higher for longer, is because I know he knows this story. And my belief is that Powell will survive as a person with his reputation intact if the US enters a recession, something I think is very unlikely this year, given the massive amounts of stimulus spending we're seeing out of Congress. What Powell won't survive is being, for his reputation, is being the next Aurthur Burns. I think he's worried about lowering rates too soon, having inflation come roaring back, and then he gets replaced and goes down in history as the second coming of Burns. I don't think he wants that to happen. And so Canada, the Bank of Canada should have known this story, but I guarantee you Jerome Powell does.
If you are new to this show, higher for longer. If you've been around for a while and heard us, higher for longer as well.